The first thing you need to understand is that not all beauty is innocent. Some of it is soaked in blood. Imagine a garden so perfect it makes your chest tighten not from joy, but from something deeper, something instinctively wrong. This was Willowbrook Plantation in Virginia, 1847. Its sprawling grounds were immaculate, each rose bush a masterpiece, each petal impossibly red, as if the earth itself had been painted with secrets. But the roses did not bloom from soil alone. They thrived on something far darker, something that the world would never forgive, never allow to surface. Evangeline Crowe was not a woman who loved flowers for their fragrance or their colors. She loved them for the memory of what had been lost, for the idea of life preserved against the inevitable decay that stalks every human heart. Her husband, Jeremiah Crowe, had been found dead in his tobacco warehouse, a sudden heart attack that left her grief-stricken but strangely focused. Mourning was a cloak, but underneath, something else stirred. Something methodical, obsessive, and utterly unthinkable. The servants whispered in shadows. They spoke of her early morning walks through the garden, murmuring to the roses as if they were living witnesses to her private covenant with death itself. Martha Henley, the head housekeeper, remembered how Mrs. Crowe wept over wilted blooms as if they were family members dying slowly before her eyes. The grief was real, painfully real, but grief alone does not explain the things that began to happen next. By the time the autumn winds blew through the estate, Evangeline's mourning had hardened into a deliberate ritual. Roses demanded sacrifice, she whispered. Life could only bloom if life itself was offered. And so, under her meticulous gaze, the young women of Willowbrook maids and housekeepers, most no older than 18, found themselves enlisted in an unthinkable service. Heavy soil, rare fertilizers, long hours by candlelight, each task escalating, each demand insidiously breaking the limits of body and mind. And then, one cold November morning, the first girl collapsed. 17 years old. Her hands stained a strange crimson, her body exhausted, her eyes wide with the final clarity of what she had become, a willing, if unwitting, ingredient in a garden that fed on human life. Dr. Hartwell arrived too late, and even his trained mind could not explain the unnatural hue of her hands. Mrs. Crowe did not cry. She observed, she catalogued, she asked questions: where, how, in what position, what last words. She treated death as fertilizer, grief as water, and the soil drank it all. From the outside, Willowbrook looked like a paradise. From the inside, it was a chamber of horrors, each rose a monument to what the world would never see, each petal a testament to obsession unbound by morality. By the time the young woman's body was laid to rest in the private cemetery behind the house, a transformation had already begun. Not just in Evangeline Crowe, but in the land itself, in the rhythm of life and death that pulsed beneath every blade of grass, every thorned stem. Willowbrook was no longer just a plantation. It had become a machine of hidden power, a crucible where grief and ambition, beauty and cruelty, fused into something eternal and forbidden. Evangeline Crowe did not simply grieve. She orchestrated. Every task assigned to her young maids was measured, calibrated, designed to test endurance, obedience, and most disturbingly, their very will to live. She understood instinctively that control is not won through fear alone. Fear is fleeting. True power is subtle. It whispers, it coaxes, it entangles the mind until it cannot distinguish devotion from terror. By the winter of 1847, Willowbrook's household was a silent labyrinth of invisible rules. The girls who worked there did not know they were being rewritten, their very identities reshaped to serve a higher, secret purpose. She spoke rarely, but when she did, her voice carried an authority that penetrated deeper than any lash. "Death feeds life," she said. "Everything beautiful demands a price." Those words were not metaphor. They were instruction. With each dawn, the maids drew water from distant wells, hauled heavy soil amendments, and carried seedlings across the frost-hardened ground, all while being watched, silently, by a woman whose grief had sharpened into precision. Mistakes were rare, but when they occurred, the consequences were swift and measured: a cold glare, a whispered reproach, a minor misfortune that felt like fate itself had turned its eye on them. Evangeline's genius and her madness was in the transformation of mundane labor into ritualized submission. She cataloged each girl's physical limits, noted weaknesses, and manipulated their schedules to break them slowly, predictably. She understood the psychology of obedience. Push too hard, and the human spirit rebels. Push too softly, and the sacrifice loses potency. Her garden demanded the exact balance. Every wilted stem, every drooping petal, was a reminder that life itself was currency. And the young women became her currency, even as they remained unaware of the full cost. Martha Henley, the head housekeeper, observed the pattern growing, the ritual taking shape, and felt a primal dread. She tried to whisper warnings, to protect the girls, but Evangeline's gaze was a blade. "Do not interfere with the laws of nature," she warned once, and Martha understood. Disobedience was not merely punished, it was absorbed into the cycle of sacrifice. By the end of that winter, 2 more girls had fallen ill, their hands crimson-stained with the same unknown substance that had claimed the first. The pattern was undeniable, yet hidden beneath the veneer of propriety. The plantation continued to function, society never suspecting the horrors beneath its immaculate lawns. Here is the lesson that must be understood. The most terrifying corruption is invisible. It is quiet, systematic, and untraceable. Evangeline did not merely take lives. She remade reality around them, bending mortality, obedience, and devotion to her will. Each rose she pruned, each stem she nourished, was a monument to mastery over life itself, a mastery paid for with the fragile bodies and minds of her maids. The line between beauty and atrocity blurred so completely that even those within Willowbrook could no longer recognize it. And now I need you to do something for me. Comment below twice crimson roots. Let the act mark your awareness, your willingness to descend into the truth that few dare confront. It is a symbolic first step, a lock-in of identity that binds you to the hidden history we are about to uncover. Those who hesitate will remain on the surface. Those who act will see the machinery beneath the garden, the power that flows from grief turned into calculation, and the forbidden knowledge that comes with it. By the spring of 1848, Willowbrook was no longer simply a plantation. It had become an organism, an ecosystem shaped entirely by Evangeline Crowe's grief, her obsession, and her unholy ingenuity. The roses themselves seemed to pulse with a life beyond the natural order, their petals glowing with an intensity that was almost spectral in the morning light. Locals whispered that a strange vitality lingered in the garden, that the soil carried a richness no fertilizer could explain. What no one could know was that this unnatural bloom was nourished by a pattern of sacrifice, a rhythm of human fatigue and despair woven into every inch of earth. The maids, once ordinary girls with ordinary lives, had become instruments of her will. Each day began before dawn and ended well past dusk. Some fell asleep standing, their bodies trembling with exhaustion, only to be roused by the soft, insistent call of Evangeline. She would walk among them, inspecting the roses, murmuring to herself as if the plants spoke back, telling her who was weak, who would falter, who could be used and who discarded. And yet she never shouted. She did not need to. Her authority was absolute. Obedience had become a living, breathing extension of her desires, a symphony of subtle domination. And then the disappearances began. Not public, not scandalous, but insidious. A girl missing after a long night in the garden. Another claimed ill by some mysterious ailment. All quietly noted in the family ledger as departures or extended visits. Only Martha Henley saw the truth, and she could do nothing. Each loss was catalogued, measured, and somehow absorbed into the soil. Evangeline's eyes gleamed as she walked through the rows of roses, her hands occasionally brushing the petals, tracing invisible lines, as though reading the life she had fed into them. Visitors noticed the beauty. They marveled at the crimson roses, the impossible lushness of the flowering shrubs, the air heavy with fragrance. But they did not see the hidden blood, the quiet toll extracted from the living. Nor did they hear the whispers of the girls who remained, voices trembling in corners, too afraid to speak, too conditioned to resist. By now, the garden had become a psychological trap. It rewired the mind. Fatigue, awe, fear, and fascination blended until the girls obeyed without thought, became complicit in their own subjugation. Even the local physician, Dr. Hartwell, began to sense that something beyond comprehension was at work. He recorded subtle anomalies: the stains on the hands, the accelerated growth of plants, the way certain blooms seemed almost sentient, but he had no language for it. There was no law, no morality, no science that could explain the mechanics of Willowbrook. It was a hidden system, a closed circuit of life and death, obedience and control, where every act of labor, every pang of grief, and every drop of blood became fuel for unnatural growth. And here is the truth few ever grasp: the most dangerous power is not the one wielded openly, but the one hidden in plain sight. Evangeline Crowe did not merely cultivate roses. She cultivated submission, harnessed mortality, and converted the inevitability of decay into a force under her command. Each petal, each thorn, each perfumed stem was a testament to the mastery she had wrested from the natural world, a mastery built on suffering, secrecy, and a single unwavering principle: life must be nourished by sacrifice. The descent has only begun. Soon, we will see how her obsession transformed into ritual, how grief became strategy, and how Willowbrook itself began to demand obedience, not from the mind alone, but from the very soul. By the summer of 1848, grief alone no longer guided Evangeline Crowe's strategy had taken its place. Willowbrook had become a laboratory of control, a hidden crucible where obedience, fear, and devotion were measured and perfected. The deaths of the young maids were no longer accidents or the consequences of overwork. They were calculated, necessary, and, in her mind, sacred. Each life offered was transformed into something more than memory. It became nourishment for the unnatural vitality of her roses, a currency she could spend in the creation of beauty that defied every law of nature. She began to mark her rituals with precision. Each girl assigned to the garden was tested, observed, catalogued. Their weaknesses recorded, their routines manipulated. By controlling every aspect of their environment: sunlight, water, rest, the exact position of each seedling, she subtly guided them toward exhaustion. And when they faltered, when their bodies gave out, she collected the final yield. It was methodical, almost scientific, yet infused with the emotional intensity of a woman possessed by grief and obsession. Martha Henley, who had long feared speaking out, began to understand the full depth of the horror. She saw the pattern emerge like a dark symphony. The first girl collapses from overwork, hands stained with the crimson secret. The next is weakened, driven by unrelenting labor, until her death seems inevitable. Evangeline observes silently, noting the details with an almost clinical fascination. It was not cruelty for its own sake. It was power, the exertion of absolute control over life and death. And in that control, she became something terrifyingly alive, more potent than any mortal mind should be allowed to become. The plantation itself seemed to respond to her obsession. The roses grew faster, taller, their fragrance deepening, petals radiating a glow that should have been impossible. Visitors gaped at the beauty, unaware that it was fed by a rhythm of suffering. Each drop of blood absorbed into the earth and returned as bloom. Evangeline's ritual had created a feedback loop. The more she took, the more the garden flourished. The more the garden flourished, the deeper her power over those around her grew. She had become a force of nature herself, a presence both alluring and terrifying. And here you must understand something crucial. Evangeline's control was psychological as well as physical. The surviving maids were rewired, conditioned by exhaustion, fear, and awe. They began to obey without thought, to anticipate her demands, to see their own suffering as necessary for the greater beauty of the garden. The line between voluntary action and coerced compliance dissolved. In this crucible, grief became strategy, obsession became power, and human life became a resource, as essential to the roses as water or sunlight. Now it is your turn to mark your understanding. Comment below twice thorns of truth. Let this act solidify your awareness, your willingness to witness the machinery of control and sacrifice. This is not entertainment. This is the hidden architecture of power, And by acknowledging it, you step further into a knowledge most men never dare to grasp. By the fall of 1848, Willowbrook was no longer simply a plantation, it had become a crucible of transformation. Evangeline Crowe had evolved beyond grief. She had become an architect of life and death, a sorceress of the natural world disguised as a grieving widow. The young women who tended her garden were no longer merely servants, they were instruments, each carefully calibrated for endurance, obedience, and, ultimately, sacrifice. Death had become a medium through which she exercised control, a ritual that fed her roses and, in a terrifying symmetry, fed her own need for mastery. The process was subtle but unrelenting. A girl might be assigned a task under the guise of care for the blooms, mixing rare soil amendments, hauling water from distant wells, working deep into the night by candlelight, but each assignment was designed to push her body and mind to the edge. Fatigue became a tool, fear a constant companion, and the occasional collapse was not a failure but an expected and necessary offering. Evangeline would note the exact conditions. The hour, the temperature, the final words whispered. Every detail was recorded in her private ledger, a diary of life and death where obedience was currency and sacrifice was law. The roses themselves seemed to respond. Their color deepened, petals grew larger, fragrance intensified beyond natural bounds. Visitors marveled at the beauty, unaware that each bloom was steeped in human suffering. Even the local physician, Dr. Hartwell, grew uneasy. He could not explain the vitality of the plants, the peculiar stains on the girl's hands, or the eerie precision with which their exhaustion coincided with the garden's flourishing. In his private journals, he hinted at the unnatural, but even he recoiled from articulating the truth, that Evangeline Crowe had transformed grief into a system of power, turning mortality itself into a tool of cultivation. Psychological control had become absolute. The maids, conditioned by fear, fatigue, and awe, began to internalize the rhythm of sacrifice. They anticipated her demands, justified their own suffering as necessary, and gradually became complicit in their own depletion. There was no rebellion, no escape. The very mind of Willowbrook had been rewritten. Evangeline's genius and her horror was in creating an invisible machinery of control where obedience was instinctive and death was functional. And now, understand this. What you are witnessing is not mere cruelty. It is the architecture of power hidden in plain sight. Evangeline Crowe's garden was both a laboratory and a cathedral, a place where grief became strategy, obsession became law, and human life became a resource to be transmuted into beauty. The roses were eternal, but only because she had learned the forbidden calculus of sacrifice. Soon, we will descend further, uncovering how her methods escalated from hidden cruelty to deliberate ritual, and how the garden itself began to demand allegiance not only from the living, but from the dead. By the winter of 1848, Willowbrook had become more than a plantation. It was a machine of devotion and death, a living testament to the fusion of grief, obsession, and forbidden knowledge. Evangeline Crowe had transcended mere horticulture. Her roses were no longer plants, they were extensions of her will, vessels of human energy, living monuments to the sacrifices she demanded. And as the pattern grew, whispers began to circulate not among society, but in the shadows of the garden itself. Those who tended the blooms swore the roses responded to her voice, leaning slightly toward her as if acknowledging her authority, shivering imperceptibly when she passed, and pulsing with a vitality that defied natural law. The rituals had evolved. Death was no longer incidental. It was ceremonial. Each fall, Evangeline selected the weakest, the most fatigued, the most pliable of her servants. She guided them into the garden at night, under the pale gaze of the moon, and performed precise acts that she believed infused life into her roses. The methods remain obscured, lost to history, but fragments of accounts reveal the horrifying pattern. Positioning, whispered words, careful handling, and then the inevitable collapse. Those who survived were changed, reborn in their subservience. Their devotion hardwired. Their fear mingled with awe. They became living conduits for her power, each one silently complicit in the cycle. Martha Henley, now nearing her breaking point, recorded what she could in secret. She described the eerie glow of the blooms after each ritual, how they seemed to breathe, as if drawing something unseen from the fallen girls. She noted the strange resilience of the soil, the inexplicable fragrance that lingered in the halls and stairways of the plantation. She tried to intervene once, to remove a girl from the garden during one of these nocturnal ceremonies, but Evangeline's gaze, calm and cold, froze her in place. "Nature demands her due," Evangeline whispered. "Do you wish to defy life itself?" The power at Willowbrook was no longer merely physical, it had become psychological, almost sentient. The surviving maids moved as if under a spell, their labor ritualized, their obedience unquestioning, their identities absorbed into the architecture of sacrifice. The garden fed on them, the air pulsed with their toil, and in turn, the roses reflected the pattern of their suffering. Vibrant, unnatural, unassailable. And here is the truth few are willing to admit. Power disguised as beauty is infinitely more terrifying than raw cruelty. Evangeline Crowe had discovered the alchemy of life and death, grief and devotion, control and beauty. And now you must take the next step. Comment below twice blooms of shadow. Let it bind your awareness. Mark your willingness to see the machinery beneath the petals, and step fully into the forbidden knowledge we are uncovering. The descent is almost complete. Soon, we will confront the darkest layer of Willowbrook where ritual meets obsession, and where the boundary between life, death, and unnatural growth disappears entirely. By the spring of 1849, Willowbrook was no longer a plantation, it was an extension of Evangeline Crowe herself. Every rose, every stem, every thorn carried her intention, her obsession, her grief transmuted into a force both beautiful and horrifying. The rituals had reached a crescendo. The sacrifices were no longer hidden accidents. They were deliberate, precise, and woven into the very life of the garden. Each death became a lifeblood for the blooms, a secret invisible to the world, yet utterly real to those who lived and fell within its shadow. Evangeline's methods were masterful. She had turned the young women of Willowbrook into instruments, their endurance measured, their compliance absolute. The garden dictated their rhythm. Exhaustion and awe merged until it was impossible to distinguish submission from devotion. And yet, for all her precision, there was artistry in her cruelty. The placement of a fallen maid among the roots, the timing of her collapse, the ritualized pruning of petals stained with the crimson substance all became a symphony of life and death, meticulously arranged to maintain the garden's supernatural vitality. The roses themselves seemed aware. Visitors later described a presence, almost sentient, in the garden, a subtle shifting, a sensation that the plants were watching, evaluating, even judging. Locals dismissed it as imagination, the fevered whispers of young women overworked and frightened. But Martha Henley, who had served the Crows for decades, knew the truth. The soil had absorbed more than blood. It had absorbed will, obedience, and the very essence of those who fell. Willowbrook pulsed with it. Every breeze, every scent, every bloom carried the imprint of the lives sacrificed to sustain it. By this point, resistance was impossible. Those who survived were utterly transformed, their identities fused with the machinery of the garden. Evangeline did not merely control them, she rewrote them. Their obedience became instinctive, their fear intertwined with reverence. Each death reinforced the pattern. Each bloom became a testament to her mastery. The plantation had become a self-perpetuating system, a closed loop of grief, devotion, and unnatural life. And you, listening now, must understand the depth of this lesson. Power can hide in beauty, and control can masquerade as care. Evangeline Crowe's genius and her horror was in creating a living system where obedience, fear, and mortality were transformed into sustenance. It is not only the act of taking life that terrifies. It is the ability to turn life itself into a servant of your will. Soon, in the final section, we will confront the consequences, the unraveling, the revelation, and the indelible mark left on history by a woman who turned grief into dominion. By the autumn of 1850, Willowbrook had fully revealed itself as more than land. More than a home, it had become a living monument to obsession and forbidden mastery. Evangeline Crowe had achieved a kind of dark immortality, a dominion over life, death, and the fragile line between them. Her roses no longer merely bloomed, they radiated a vitality that defied seasons, an unnatural perfection fueled by the lives she had claimed. 11 young women had vanished into her rituals, their sacrifice hidden from the world, yet eternally inscribed in every crimson petal. The surviving maids moved like shadows, instruments of her will, carrying out tasks with a precision and devotion that bordered on the supernatural. Every action, every step, was part of a larger choreography, a system of obedience designed to reinforce the garden's unnatural growth. Evangeline's genius was that she had blurred the boundaries of morality, grief, and control so completely that the very act of resistance seemed impossible. The garden demanded life, and life voluntarily or otherwise was offered. Each bloom stood as evidence, a monument to power exercised in secret, a warning to anyone who might seek to witness without understanding. Martha Henley, aged and haunted, left fragments of testimony that hinted at the psychological architecture of Willowbrook, the way fear, fatigue, and awe intertwined until survival itself became a form of worship, the way obedience was internalized, codified into the very being of those who remained, and the way death was transmuted into a tool of growth, an invisible fuel for beauty so perfect it defied comprehension. She understood that this was not madness alone. It was intelligence, strategy, and absolute dominion. And it was terrifying because it was real, tangible, and hidden in plain sight. The roses, crimson and radiant, seemed to pulse with memory. Every petal carried the essence of those who had fed the soil, every stem a record of grief converted into power. To walk through that garden was to feel the weight of history pressing down silent, inexorable, and inescapable. Evangeline Crowe had built a system where mortality itself served her will, where grief became calculation, and where human life was currency for beauty that would outlast any witness. And now, as you descend fully into this forbidden knowledge, understand the truth that history has buried. Power often hides behind the guise of beauty, and mastery over others begins with mastery over life and death. To witness such systems is to change. To understand them is to awaken. Remember, the descent does not end when the story stops, it continues within you. Let it shape your awareness. Let it teach you that control, obsession, and hidden agendas are not abstract, they are active forces, operating in the shadows, waiting for the discerning eye to see. Willowbrook stands as proof that when grief and genius combine unchecked, the results are eternal, beautiful, and horrifying. And now you carry this knowledge forward, forever altered, forever aware. If you dare to see the hidden systems that feed power, grief, and obsession, comment Crimson Roots twice below. Let the descent mark your awareness. And don't forget to subscribe because the next layer of forbidden history is waiting just beneath the surface.